Wyatt eased his faded silver coupe onto the track, surrounded by machines worth more than his garage combined. Laughter rippled through the crowd at his battered paint job. Hunter, the billionaire who owned every asphalt strip in sight, smiled with contempt and made his offer public. Win a single race, he said, and the luxury garage complex would belong to Wyatt forever. Lose, and Wyatt would surrender the only workshop that fed his family. Nobody understood why Wyatt walked to the back of his car and opened the trunk. The moment they saw what waited inside, Hunter's smile disappeared completely. If clever emotional reversals of fortune speak to you, stay until the very end to uncover the whole shocking truth. Wyatt had spent 5 years learning how to live inside silence. The house still held traces of his late wife in ways he had never bothered to erase. A coffee mug she liked on the shelf, a jacket still hanging by the door, a photograph of their daughter propped on the workbench where he could see it every time he looked up from an engine. He worked with his hands because his hands were the only part of him that still knew exactly what to do. His garage sat on the edge of town, a low building with a tin roof that rattled when the wind picked up, and inside it he restored cars that everyone else had already given up on. People brought him vehicles that dealerships refused to touch, machines with cracked frames and dead transmissions, and he brought them back to life one bolt at a time. He had once been an engineer, the kind who worked on drivetrains for a company that no longer wanted to remember his name, but that story stayed folded away, unspoken, tucked behind the quiet routine of daily repairs. Money had become a persistent, gnawing problem. The bank had sent 3 notices in as many months, each one more clipped than the last. Each one a countdown toward a date circled in red on a calendar Wyatt tried not to look at. He was weeks away from losing the only place that still made sense to him, the only place where grief had somewhere useful to go. His daughter, 7 years old and fiercely observant, had asked him once why he came home so late smelling of grease and metal, and he had told her that some things were worth fixing even when they seemed beyond repair. She had nodded like she understood completely, the way children sometimes do, and gone back to her drawing, and Wyatt had stood in the doorway a long moment, feeling the weight of every unpaid bill pressing against his ribs. Charlotte arrived in that world like someone stepping onto a stage she had built herself. She was 33, sharp-eyed, and had just closed the deal of her career, acquiring a struggling chain of private racetracks with the kind of confidence that made boardrooms go quiet. She had grown up around engines, too, though her path had run through business school instead of grease-stained coveralls, and she judged people not by their bank accounts but by what they could actually do under pressure. She wanted to build something real, a performance vehicle brand that meant something beyond marketing, and she believed the industry was drowning in men who talked louder than they worked. She had little patience for spectacle, and even less for cruelty, though she often found herself standing beside both because business demanded certain alliances whether she liked them or not. One of those alliances was Hunter, a name spoken with a mixture of admiration and dread across every track in the country. He owned a chain of raceways and fielded a professional racing team that had never lost to an amateur, not once, not in a decade of contests staged as much for spectacle as for competition. Hunter enjoyed humiliation the way other men enjoyed fine wine, savoring it slowly, making sure everyone present understood exactly who held the power in the room. Charlotte appeared beside him often enough that onlookers assumed partnership meant friendship, but the truth was colder and more transactional than that. She needed his tracks for her launch events, and he needed her company's reputation to legitimize his own, and neither of them mistook the arrangement for anything warmer than convenience. Wyatt had come to the track that morning for one reason only, a modest booth reserved for local businesses hoping to attract new customers during the exhibition weekend. He hoped a few racing enthusiasts might notice his work and send restoration jobs his way. Enough to buy himself another month before the bank came calling in earnest. He had not planned on entering any competition, had not planned on drawing attention at all, and he certainly had not expected the sight that greeted him when he pulled his old coupe through the gates. Rows of gleaming supercars lined the paddock, their paint catching the morning light like something poured from a furnace, engines idling with the low, expensive growl of machines that cost more than most houses. His own car looked exactly like what it was. A project car he had rebuilt himself from a wreck nobody wanted, silver paint gone dull with age, a small dent along the rear panel he had never bothered to fix. Laughter followed him as he parked, quiet at first, then louder as more people noticed. Someone joked that he must have taken a wrong turn on his way to a scrapyard. Another voice suggested he was lost, that the classic car show must be somewhere else entirely. Wyatt said nothing. He had absorbed worse over the years. And mockery from strangers barely registered anymore, not when he had bigger things pressing on his mind, like the calendar back home with its red circle drawing closer every single day. He walked toward his booth with his head level and his shoulders steady, ignoring the stares, focused only on getting through the day and heading home to his daughter. It was Hunter who noticed him first, drawn by the ripple of laughter the way a shark notices disturbed water. Hunter crossed the paddock with the easy stride of a man who had never once doubted his own superiority, trailed by two assistants who seemed to exist mainly to laugh at whatever he said. He studied Wyatt's coupe with theatrical disbelief, circling it slowly, running one hand along the hood as if inspecting livestock at auction. Charlotte watched from a short distance away, arms crossed, her expression harder to read than Hunter's, something closer to curiosity than contempt. She had built her reputation on recognizing talent before the rest of the industry caught up, and something about the way Wyatt stood his ground, refusing to shrink under the weight of ridicule, caught her attention in a way she did not immediately understand. Hunter raised his voice loud enough for the growing crowd to hear, clearly enjoying the audience he had gathered. He asked with mock sincerity whether Wyatt intended to race that afternoon, whether he seriously believed a car held together with spare parts belonged anywhere near a professional track. The crowd laughed again, louder this time, and Wyatt felt heat rise in his neck, not from embarrassment but from something quieter and more dangerous, a memory stirring beneath the surface of years he had tried very hard to leave behind. He looked at Hunter for a long moment, taking in the tailored suit, the practiced sneer, the confidence of a man who had never once been forced to answer for anything. Something in that face was familiar, though Wyatt could not yet place exactly why, and the unease of that recognition settled into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. Hunter looked at the coupe one more time, then turned to the crowd with the flourish of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment in his mind long before it happened. He announced that he would make a proposal, something generous, something no reasonable man could refuse. If Wyatt could win a single race against any driver of Hunter's choosing, the entire luxury garage complex Hunter owned across town, workshops, equipment, everything, would become Wyatt's property outright. The crowd erupted, half in disbelief, half already sensing the trap being laid in plain sight. Hunter smiled and let the noise build before continuing, his voice dropping just enough to sound almost reasonable, almost fair. But if Wyatt lost, the terms would run the other direction entirely. Wyatt would sign over his own garage, every tool, every piece of equipment, the small workshop that had kept his family fed since the day he opened it. He would lose his trade, his livelihood, the last stable thing standing between his daughter and complete uncertainty. Hunter raised the stakes further still, adding that Wyatt would also forfeit any claim to the modest reputation his little business had built over the years, effectively erasing him from the local trade entirely. The crowd went quiet, sensing that this had crossed from spectacle into something closer to cruelty. Charlotte stepped forward before she fully decided to. She told Hunter this had gone too far, that pitting an amateur against his professional roster wasn't competition, it was theater dressed up as fairness. Hunter waved her off without even glancing her way, reminding her that business was business. He knew with the casual certainty of a man who had never lost a wager in his life that Wyatt had no lawyer standing beside him, nothing but a battered coupe and whatever pride still remained after years of being overlooked. Hunter's assistants produced a contract almost instantly, as though they had been carrying it in anticipation of exactly this outcome. Wyatt read the document slowly, ignoring the impatient shuffle of the crowd around him. Every line confirmed what he already suspected, that this had been designed to crush him quietly and publicly at the same time, a spectacle Hunter could point to later as proof of his own dominance. And yet Wyatt did not hesitate for long. Something in Hunter's smugness, in the particular cruelty of his phrasing, had reached past irritation and touched an old, buried memory that Wyatt had spent years trying to forget. He signed his name at the bottom of the page with a steady hand, the pen barely trembling, and handed the contract back without a word of protest. The crowd murmured in disbelief, certain they were witnessing a man sign away his own future in front of a paying audience. Someone called out that he must be desperate or foolish or both. Charlotte studied Wyatt's face carefully, searching for panic and finding none, only a strange quiet calm that unsettled her more than any protest could have. She had negotiated enough contracts to recognize when someone signed out of fear, and this was not that. This was something closer to certainty, though she could not yet explain where it came from. Hunter, delighted with himself, clapped once and announced the race would begin within the hour, giving Wyatt just enough time to prepare his ancient, unremarkable machine for a contest everyone assumed was already decided. With the contract signed and witnessed, Wyatt walked back toward his coupe with the same unhurried steps he had used to cross the paddock earlier that morning. The crowd expected him to check his engine, to pop the hood and search for some miracle upgrade hidden beneath the old plating, some secret that might explain his strange composure. Instead, he moved to the rear of the vehicle and lifted the trunk open, revealing nothing that anyone had anticipated. There was no cash inside, no spare engine, no hidden canister of nitrous waiting to give an old car an impossible edge. What waited inside instead was an aging laptop, its casing scratched from years of use, resting atop a thick stack of folders bound with rubber bands gone brittle with age. Beneath the folders sat a battered external hard drive, a leather-bound journal filled with technical notes in cramped handwriting, and a manila envelope stamped with the seal of a patent office. Tucked alongside these was a small collection of photographs, faded at the edges, showing early prototype components photographed on a workbench that looked remarkably similar to the one still standing in Wyatt's own garage. Hunter's face changed the moment he saw the contents, a flicker of something colder passing behind his eyes before he could smooth it away with practiced composure. Charlotte noticed the shift immediately, her attention sharpening the way it always did when she sensed a negotiation had suddenly changed shape without her fully understanding why. Wyatt spoke calmly, his voice carrying just far enough for those nearby to hear without needing to raise it. He explained without any trace of theater that the documents in front of him proved something important, something that predated this contest by many years. The drivetrain technology Hunter had spent the better part of a decade marketing as his own innovation, the very system his professional racing team relied on to dominate every amateur challenger who dared step onto his tracks, had originally been designed by Wyatt himself, long before Hunter's company had ever claimed it. The folders held early schematics. The journal held dated notes tracking each stage of development. The photographs showed prototypes built years before Hunter's company announced its supposedly revolutionary system to the public. Hunter's easy confidence cracked for just a moment, a hairline fracture quickly papered over with a dismissive laugh, though the laugh landed thinner than his usual bravado. He accused Wyatt of fabricating documents, of staging an elaborate stunt to distract from an unwinnable race, but his voice carried less certainty than it had only minutes earlier. Charlotte stepped closer, her business instincts overriding her earlier hesitation, studying the dates stamped across the patent envelope with unmistakable interest. She said nothing yet, unwilling to draw conclusions before she had time to examine everything properly, but the careful stillness in her expression suggested she had already begun connecting pieces Hunter clearly hoped would remain scattered. Wyatt did not elaborate further. He closed the trunk with the same unhurried calm he had opened it with, leaving the crowd murmuring in confusion, uncertain what any of it meant or how it connected to the race everyone had gathered to watch. Whispers spread through the paddock, theories multiplying faster than anyone could confirm them, while Hunter's assistants exchanged uneasy glances behind his back. For the first time since Wyatt had arrived at the track that morning, Hunter looked less like a man enjoying a performance and more like someone recalculating the odds of a game he had assumed was already won. The track cleared within the hour, marshals waving spectators toward the barriers while technicians rolled Hunter's chosen vehicle into position, a machine engineered for exactly one purpose, crushing anyone foolish enough to challenge it. Hunter had selected his fastest car for the occasion, a gleaming monster of a machine bristling with upgrades that cost more than most people earned in several years combined, its engine growling with a menace that seemed to promise the outcome before the race had even begun. Wyatt brought nothing new to the starting line. No fresh turbo installation, no last-minute modification, nothing but the same weathered coupe he had driven through the gates that morning, its paint dull, its body carrying years of honest repair rather than expensive performance upgrades. The starting signal dropped, and Hunter's car surged forward with the kind of brutal acceleration that made the crowd gasp collectively. Wyatt's coupe lagged behind almost immediately, falling several lengths back within the opening stretch, and laughter rippled through the stands once more, confirming everyone's expectations. Charlotte watched in silence, arms folded, refusing to join the mockery even as doubt crept into her own calculations. She had seen enough races to recognize a mismatch when it unfolded in front of her, and this looked, by every visible measure, like exactly that. But Wyatt was not racing the way the crowd assumed he was racing. He held his coupe at a measured, controlled pace, refusing to burn through his tires chasing an early lead he had no intention of claiming yet. Every corner he took with deliberate restraint, conserving rubber and brakes while Hunter's driver, following instructions relayed through an earpiece, pushed the machine harder with each passing lap, determined to humiliate the challenger as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. Charlotte noticed the pattern before most of the crowd did, the way Wyatt's car settled into a rhythm that looked almost lazy from a distance but carried the precision of something carefully calculated. By the fifth lap, Hunter's aggressive pace had begun exacting its cost. The brakes on his machine, pushed far beyond their intended limits, started fading under the relentless heat generated by lap after lap of hard acceleration and harder braking. The tires, chosen more for their marketing appeal than their durability under sustained punishment, began losing grip at exactly the corners where control mattered most. Wyatt, still holding his measured pace, began closing the gap, almost imperceptibly at first, then with growing, undeniable momentum. The crowd's laughter faded into a tense, uncertain murmur as they registered what was happening on the track in front of them. Hunter's driver, sensing the shift, attempted to force the issue, drifting wide on the final turns in a maneuver clearly intended to force Wyatt off the racing line entirely. Wyatt had anticipated exactly this kind of desperation, having studied the same aggressive tendencies for years in a career he rarely spoke about, and he adjusted his line a fraction of a second before the contact could land, sliding past on the inside with barely enough room to spare. The crowd rose to its feet as one, disbelief giving way to something closer to astonishment. Wyatt crossed the finish line first by the narrowest of margins, a gap so small that officials needed several tense minutes to confirm the result on their timing equipment. The stadium fell into a stunned, disbelieving silence broken only by asks and the low murmur of people recalculating everything they thought they understood about the man in the battered silver coupe. Hunter sat frozen behind the wheel of his own machine, staring straight ahead, his earlier confidence replaced by something far colder and far more uncertain. Charlotte found herself smiling despite every instinct telling her to remain composed, a small, private smile she quickly suppressed before anyone could notice it forming. Hunter refused to accept the result even as officials confirmed it over the loudspeaker. He stormed off his car and marched toward the timing booth, insisting loudly that no amateur driver could have beaten his professional roster without some form of cheating buried in that ridiculous old coupe. He demanded an inspection, certain that hidden components would surface the moment mechanics opened the hood, certain that his own humiliation could still be reframed as someone else's dishonesty. The crowd watched with fresh interest, sensing that the day's drama had not yet reached its conclusion. Wyatt walked calmly back to his car and opened the trunk a second time, though this time he did not stop at a handful of folders. He laid out the entire collection of evidence across the hood of his coupe, arranging it with the same methodical patience he brought to every engine he had ever rebuilt. There were old company emails, printed and yellowed with age, exchanges that referenced a young engineer's contributions to an early prototype system. There was a signed employment contract, dated years before Hunter's company had gone public with what it called groundbreaking drivetrain technology. There was raw testing data, timestamps carefully preserved alongside video footage of early prototype runs conducted in a modest testing facility that no longer existed under that name. Charlotte moved forward without waiting for anyone's permission and began examining the documents herself, her trained eye moving quickly across dates and signatures with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years reviewing contracts for a living. Everything checked out with uncomfortable consistency. The dates aligned. The signatures matched records she recognized from her own company's historical filings. The technical notes in the journal described, in granular detail, a system that closely mirrored the very technology Hunter's racing team had built its entire reputation upon. The full picture emerged slowly as Wyatt continued speaking, his voice steady despite years of frustration underlying every word. Hunter had employed him many years earlier, back when his company was still modest, trying to establish itself in a crowded market. Wyatt had poured himself into that early work, spending months developing a drivetrain system he genuinely believed could change the industry, only to watch Hunter claim the resulting breakthrough entirely for himself once it proved successful. Wyatt had been quietly pushed out shortly afterward, his name scrubbed from internal records, his contributions folded into the company's official history, as though he had never been involved at all. The small garage Wyatt now ran had begun as nothing more than a place to survive that loss, a modest workshop where he could rebuild something of his own after watching everything else get taken from him. He had never intended to reveal any of this publicly, had carried the documents in his trunk for years less out of strategy than habit, unwilling to let go of proof that once mattered desperately to him and had since become something closer to a private wound he carried quietly. The unexpected wager Hunter had proposed that morning had simply forced his hand sooner than he ever planned. The crowd's mood shifted visibly as the story unfolded, laughter and mockery giving way to something closer to sympathy and quiet outrage. People who had jeered at Wyatt's battered coupe only hours earlier now studied him with newfound respect, murmuring among themselves about the unfairness of what he had endured. Hunter attempted several more denials, each one landing weaker than the last, his composure fraying visibly under the weight of evidence he could no longer dismiss as fabrication. Charlotte stood at the center of it all, documents in hand, already beginning to understand that the day's events had opened a door that would not easily close again. Charlotte did not wait for the dust to settle before taking action. Within days, she had launched a full internal investigation into her business partner's history, pulling records that Hunter had assumed were buried far too deep for anyone to find. She approached the matter with the same discipline she brought to every acquisition, methodical and unwilling to let personal discomfort slow her down, even though the man under scrutiny was someone she had stood beside at countless public events. Word of the confrontation at the track had already begun spreading through industry circles, and Charlotte understood that her own credibility now depended on how thoroughly she pursued the truth. Hunter, sensing the walls closing in, attempted to erase what evidence he could reach. He dispatched associates to pressure former employees into silence and tried, through quiet, indirect maneuvering, to have certain digital records quietly deleted before investigators could examine them. What he failed to anticipate was Wyatt's habit of preserving everything in duplicate, a practice born of old caution rather than foresight into this exact moment. Copies existed in secure storage that Hunter's people could not touch, time-stamped and verified in ways that made tampering pointless. Lawyers arrived within the week, retained not by Wyatt, who still could not afford such representation, but by Charlotte herself, who saw both a moral obligation and a business necessity in seeing the matter through properly. Several former engineers who had worked alongside Wyatt years earlier came forward once they learned he was finally being heard, describing in consistent detail how Hunter's company had systematically claimed credit for work performed by others. One former director, long since retired and apparently unburdened by any remaining loyalty, confirmed publicly that Hunter had pulled multiple employees over the years into signing away patent rights under conditions that bordered on coercion, threats of termination disguised as routine paperwork. The revelations spread quickly once the first public statement was issued. Financial markets reacted within hours, shares in Hunter's company sliding sharply as analysts questioned the foundation of intellectual property the business had relied upon for years. Sponsors who had once eagerly attached their names to Hunter's racing team began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with a scandal that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Drivers who had competed under his banner, some visibly uncomfortable being connected to the unfolding story, began quietly negotiating exits from their contracts, unwilling to have their own reputations tied to a collapse that showed no sign of slowing. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, Hunter found himself without leverage, without an easy way to spin the narrative back in his favor. Reporters who had once treated him with deferential caution now asked pointed, uncomfortable questions he had no rehearsed answer for. The empire he had built on borrowed innovation and carefully cultivated intimidation began showing cracks that no amount of money could immediately repair. And for the first time, Hunter understood what it felt like to stand on the losing side of a contest he had never expected to enter. Late one evening, alone in an office that suddenly felt far too large for him, Hunter paged through headlines that grew more damning by the hour. He thought back, with a bitterness he could not quite name, to the young engineer he had once dismissed so easily, never imagining that a single overlooked man might one day unravel everything. The silence in that office felt heavier than any courtroom verdict, and Hunter finally considered that the wager he had staged so carelessly might cost him far more than a single garage. Charlotte drove out to Wyatt's garage on a quiet weekday evening without calling ahead, telling herself the visit was purely professional, a matter of confirming details for the ongoing investigation. She parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching the low building with its rattling tin roof through the fading evening light, uncertain why she felt oddly nervous approaching a man she had already vouched for publicly. When she finally stepped inside, she found a scene entirely different from what she expected. Wyatt was crouched beside an old sedan, guiding the hands of an elderly veteran through a brake repair, patiently explaining each step without a hint of impatience despite the late hour. A teenage boy swept metal shavings nearby, clearly an apprentice rather than paid staff, listening intently to every word Wyatt offered as though it carried the weight of scripture. In the corner, another vehicle sat with a handwritten note taped to its windshield, indicating the repair had been completed at no charge for a family Charlotte did not recognize. Nobody in the room seemed aware of the investigation consuming headlines elsewhere. Nobody treated Wyatt like a man on the verge of public vindication. To them, he was simply the person who fixed what other people had given up on. Charlotte stood near the doorway for several minutes before Wyatt noticed her, and when he finally did, he offered nothing more dramatic than a tired, genuine smile, waving her inside as though her arrival were entirely ordinary. She watched him work for another hour, asking occasional questions that had little to do with contracts or evidence, and Wyatt answered each one honestly, without performance, without any attempt to frame his own struggles as tragedy. He never mentioned the years of hardship directly, never complained about the sleepless nights or the constant pressure of bills he could barely keep pace with. Instead, he told her simply that the garage had never been only about repairing engines. It held something larger for the people who walked through its doors, a place where dismissed dreams were occasionally given a second chance, where a veteran forgotten by every other institution could feel useful again for an afternoon, where a struggling teenager could learn a trade that no classroom had ever offered him. Charlotte listened in a silence that felt different from her usual composed attentiveness, something warmer settling behind her professional exterior. She left the garage that night with a growing, uncomfortable awareness that she had misjudged something important weeks earlier, mistaking Wyatt's quiet composure for desperation rather than what it actually was, a deep and steady conviction in the value of his own work. Driving home under a sky already darkening toward night, she found herself replaying small details from the evening, the patience in his voice, the easy respect he commanded from people who owed him nothing but gratitude. For the first time in longer than she could easily admit, Charlotte began to wonder whether her earlier assumptions about strength and success had been built on entirely the wrong foundation. Hunter, cornered by mounting scandal and desperate to salvage some fragment of his public image, proposed one final race, insisting it had nothing to do with money or property this time. He wanted, he claimed, a chance to reclaim his dignity in front of the same crowd that had witnessed his unraveling, a final contest fought purely for pride rather than any material stake. Charlotte suspected the request carried more desperation than sincerity, but she did not intervene, curious to see how Wyatt would respond to an offer stripped of any real consequence. Wyatt agreed without hesitation, though not out of any need to prove something to Hunter personally. He had already reclaimed everything that mattered, his reputation, his integrity, the quiet dignity of years finally acknowledged in public. If anything, he agreed because refusing would have felt like leaving a sentence unfinished, a final punctuation mark the story still deserved before it could properly close. The track filled again on the appointed afternoon, though the atmosphere carried none of the mocking energy from weeks earlier. This time the crowd watched with something closer to reverence, aware they were witnessing the closing chapter of a story that had captivated the entire region. Hunter climbed into his car with visibly less swagger than before, his earlier bravado replaced by a tight, controlled tension that betrayed how much this moment actually meant to him. The race unfolded without any of the drama or gamesmanship of their first encounter. Wyatt drove with the calm precision that had become his signature, reading every corner with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime studying machines rather than merely operating them. Hunter pushed hard from the opening lap, aware that a measured pace would not be enough to erase the humiliation still hanging over him, but desperation rarely produces good driving, and his aggression cost him precious seconds at exactly the moments that mattered most. Wyatt crossed the finish line well ahead this time, no photo finish required, no tense wait for officials to confirm the result on delayed equipment. The gap was decisive, unmistakable, a clean demonstration of skill rather than luck or circumstance. The crowd rose to its feet again, though this time the applause carried none of the disbelief from before, Only the steady, satisfied roar of people who had come to see justice settled fairly on open asphalt. Hunter sat in his car for a long moment after the race ended, staring at the track ahead of him, finally understanding that no amount of money or intimidation could manufacture the kind of mastery Wyatt had built through years of quiet, unglamorous work. Every advantage he had ever relied upon, wealth, reputation, the fear he inspired in people who depended on his goodwill, had proven useless against a man who simply understood machines better than he ever would. When he finally stepped out of the vehicle, he offered a single, reluctant nod toward Wyatt, the closest thing to an apology the crowd would ever witness him give, before walking off the track without another word to anyone. The weeks following the second race moved quickly, each day bringing another development in the collapse of Hunter's carefully constructed empire. His own board of directors, no longer willing to absorb the reputational damage piling up around them, voted to remove him from his executive position entirely, citing the mounting evidence of stolen intellectual property and years of documented mistreatment toward employees who had trusted him. Hunter left the company headquarters for the final time without any of the fanfare that had once surrounded his public appearances, slipping out a side entrance while cameras waited uselessly at the front. Charlotte, meanwhile, moved forward with finalizing her acquisition of the struggling racetrack chain, though the terms she ultimately settled on looked nothing like what anyone had originally expected. Rather than absorbing Wyatt's small garage into her growing business empire as a minor asset, the way Hunter's original wager had implied she might, she chose an entirely different path. She restructured the agreement so that instead of gaining ownership over anything belonging to Wyatt, she handed him full operational control over the newly acquired garage complex, the very facility Hunter had once dangled as a prize meant to humiliate him. Wyatt found himself, almost overnight, transformed from a man fighting to save a single modest workshop into the director of an entire operation, though the shift never seemed to change who he actually was. He refused any title that suggested distance from the work itself, insisting on staying involved in every repair bay personally rather than retreating into an office removed from the grease and noise that had defined his career from the very beginning. He was not merely an employee following someone else's direction, nor was he simply another manager overseeing operations from a comfortable distance. He had become something closer to a steward, entrusted with an expanded version of the very purpose his original garage had always served. The old workshop itself remained untouched, its tin roof still rattling in strong wind, its modest equipment unchanged despite the sudden expansion of Wyatt's responsibilities elsewhere. He insisted on preserving it exactly as it had always been, refusing suggestions that it be renovated or absorbed into the larger complex now under his direction. It stood instead as a quiet monument to everything that had led him to this point, proof that patience and integrity could outlast even the most calculated attempts to erase them. Visitors to the new facility often asked about the small building still operating a short drive away, and Wyatt answered the same way every time, explaining simply that some things deserved to remain exactly as they were, unpolished and honest. A reminder of where every genuine success actually begins. Word of what had happened spread throughout the wider industry, reaching engineers and mechanics who recognized in Wyatt's story something rarely acknowledged publicly: the quiet persistence required to survive being overlooked for years without losing faith in one's own work. Letters arrived at the garage from strangers who had followed the unfolding events, grateful that a story like his had finally received the attention it deserved. Months passed and the new garage complex settled into a steady rhythm entirely its own. Wyatt spent his days training a growing group of young mechanics, passing along not just technical skill but the patience and care he believed mattered just as much as any wrench or diagnostic tool. His daughter, now old enough to understand at least the outline of what had happened, occasionally visited after school, sitting quietly on an overturned crate while she watched her father work, proud in a way she could not yet fully articulate but clearly felt. Charlotte visited often too, though her presence no longer carried the formality of those early encounters months earlier. She stopped announcing herself as an executive checking on an investment, and started arriving simply as someone glad for the company, someone who found herself looking forward to the easy conversation that had grown between them since that quiet evening she first watched him work. Neither of them spoke openly about what exactly this friendship had become, content instead to let it unfold at its own unhurried pace, the way Wyatt approached everything